The 5th of November, the Media Center of Ukraine continues. My name is Svetlana Chipurenko, and now we will discuss how to prove the complicity of Russian propaganda spreaders in the international crimes and how to submit to International Criminal Court. And I will introduce our participants, Anna Mykytenko, international criminal lawyer, Iryna Siedova, investigative journalist and researcher at the Criminal Human Rights Group, Crimean Human Rights Group, Volodymyr Borodianskyi, creator of the War of Words project, and Olha Skrypnyk, head of the board of the Crimean Human Rights Group. So, Ms. Olga, please tell us why the Crimean Human Rights Group decided to focus on this issue and why it's important. Good day. Thanks. First of all, I would like to thank to the armed forces of Ukraine for they ensure that we can continue our work, and I want to thank journalists who risk their lives to highlight, to cover the truth in Ukraine. And our focus indeed is to document Russian criminal war crimes starting from 2014, and after the first days of occupation of Crimea, we started to document many international crimes which Russian Federation still continues committing at the occupied Crimea and at other occupied territories. And unfortunately, in terms of persecution of the population, it all, especially representatives of civil society, it started from the first days of the occupation of Crimea. And after that, it turned into systematic persecution, a punitive system. But besides the Russian committing tortures and deprivation of free will and freedom, deprivation of freedom, we learned that this policy, this is the policy of the Russian Federation, but it's always accompanied by propaganda. When it comes to persecution of indigenous population, Crimean Tatars, such detentions always have been accompanied by massive disinformation, blaming them, labeling them as terrorists, etc. This is like a traditional approach of the Russian Federation. The same is persecution of civil activists. Also, such detention of such people always was accompanied by propaganda, blaming that they were terrorists, etc. And so propaganda is part of the crime of their crimes committed by the Russian Federation. Since 2022, we continued monitoring Russian media environment, and it was obvious for us to notice that Russian propaganda workers, so-called journalists, media professionals, so to speak, they discarded any attempts to refer to the standards of freedom of speech, to the standards of journalism, and they just moved directly to open destruction of the Ukrainian civil society, Ukrainian true journalism. And we understood that it goes outside of the boundaries of the hate speech, and we realized that we need to track the crimes of the people who are involved in the persecution of civilians. And we started to document their narratives, their statements, and everything, what they do, these propaganda workers. And then we realized that we have some perspectives from the point of the international criminal law, and hence we recently we submitted to the prosecutor office of the International Criminal Court the statement. And in the context of Ukraine, unfortunately, disinformation and propaganda is a very effective tool in other regions of Ukraine, not only in Crimea. And we also came to the level of technology and to the level of use of propaganda, which puts the entire regions under threat. And first of all, human rights are under threat. And so we hope that the work which we have done and we continue doing, it will help not only Ukraine, but also in the international context. We will be able to find the tools which will reduce the level, the threatening level of disinformation, which threatens not only Ukraine but also other countries and other regions. And here I would like to thank to the colleagues who supported us, Ms. Anya, who is from the point of international criminal law, was looking at the situation. And I'm also grateful to Volodymyr Borodianskyi, who also cooperated with us, with our teams, and we're grateful to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Netherlands, who supported our initiative and provided their support to us. And how we collected evidence, my colleagues will explain in greater detail. Thank you, Ms. Olga. I think it's very important that now Russian propaganda workers, we put the Russian propaganda workers at one level of war criminals. We call them directly war criminals, and we clearly document the crimes committed by them. So, Ms. Iryna, please tell us more how you collected evidence, what propaganda workers base you collected, and what narratives you recorded. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we started more targetedly to collect not only the hate speech, but also the calls for crimes against humanity and calls for genocide. And so, but mostly we focused on Russian state TV channels, which were financed from the Russian state budget, because the collection of such evidence, we can prove that this is the state policy. It's not just individual initiative of some bloggers or TV hosts, but we want to prove that this is a state policy. And so we started to collect the statements, the quotes, which were subject to the international criminal law, and we started to collect and analyze those statements, to systemize those statements with the help of open database, which is called Uncovering the Crimes of Russian Propaganda Workers. Over the last year, we collected over 600 statements, most of which are calls for bombardment of civil infrastructure, for destruction of Ukrainians as a nation, for elimination of Ukraine as a state, Ukrainians as nation, and the calls for aggressive war and for grabbing more territory of Ukraine. So we put these statements in our open database. We systemized the narratives when they disseminate these calls, instigation, because besides them calling for those international crimes, they also put the foundation and justification for their calls for crimes. And in particular, this justification is not there's not a lot of justification. They just they're constantly repeating the same justification. Of course, they justify it, saying that here are all Nazis, terrorists, fascists, that Ukraine is a threat to the safety of Russians. And in particular, these narratives, they spread not only at TV channels, but also in Telegram channels, which have millions in the audience. And after we analyzed and did triage of these statements, we revealed a certain logic between the statements, that the most of the statements, most of the calls are targeted against the civil population, calling for destruction of energy infrastructure, because when they say, like, if in Ukraine the electricity is turned off, then Ukrainian journalists will not be able to propagate, to promote fascist information, and if the civil population suffers, then the Ukrainian population will quicker surrender to Russia. And so we collected 50 people who proclaim these statements, these calls. And when we collected these statements, when we were collecting these statements, we were helped by fireworks service, and my colleagues will tell in greater detail about it. And I just wanted to say that when we submitted this statement to the International Criminal Court, we took 3 persons, and wrote their names in our submission to the International Court, but all other people, these Russian propaganda workers, they also could be the objects of prosecution. And so we will submit the same evidence to the Ukrainian prosecutor office. And in the interesting detail in our research was that thanks to the service, we managed to involve artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence helped us to collect, in terms of calling to destroy civilian infrastructure, bombarding Ukrainian infrastructure. Artificial intelligence helped us to collect evidence because there is a huge, big volume of such statements, calls for destruction of civil infrastructure. So we did not have enough human resources to collect all the evidence by human resources. So artificial intelligence helped us to collect all those evidence, and then we systemized them and proved, and by this we proved the regularity, because the several days before and several days after the bombardment, active bombardment, there is a systematic call for the bombardment, and they explain why they need to bombard Ukrainian cities. And after that, they justify, after the severe bombardment, they justify why they bombed. They say that they bombed military infrastructure, which is fake. And so we can see the relation between the propaganda calls, which they do before, several days before, and several days after the bombardment. And so we collected this information, and I would like for Volodymyr Borodianskyi to explain about this analytical service of words. Thank you, Ms. Iryna. Mr. Volodymyr, please tell us about your service, and I really heard that it would be difficult to do the work which has been done. Thank you. Our service is quite simple. It just several archives. In 2022, we thought to create, in order to document Russian crimes, the proclamations, criminal proclamations. We thought that it was necessary to document those calls so that later we could apply to court and to seek justice and statements to Russian criminals. And in 2022, with Microsoft software, we created this service. So what this service does? Its service collects recordings from Russian TV channels, Telegram channels, puts it into words and translates in English, and then uploads it into the interface, online interface. And basically, this service basically deciphers hundreds of hours of these recordings, and then the specialists, they analyze the deciphering, and it's all free of charge. It's in the English language and allows to be viewed and to be read, this information, but by everyone around the world. And so it all happens live, but behind all those events which go very quickly, a lot of details could be lost. In particular, people who call for genocide, who instigate hatred, they live behind the scene, behind those terrible events. They are military criminals, they are war criminals in our opinion. And what we're doing, we collect the database which later journalists, researchers can analyze, and based on this information, prepare materials, prepare articles, and to stop this propaganda from spreading. Thank you, Mr. Volodymyr. Ms. Anna, if to look at this evidence from the international criminal law, how can this evidence be used to charge these propaganda workers with responsibility, which we all would like? Yes, of course, we would all like that, but here I have to start by saying that it's very difficult. It's not an easy work, and despite the fact that we all, as readers, as viewers, we understand that many from the statements made, which are making in the Russian social media and TV channel, they are absolutely outrageous, and we understand all that that's a hatred speech, that's calls to commit crimes against Ukrainians or to destroy the Ukrainians or Ukraine as a country, as nation. But from the legal point of view, not everything which we hear on TV or in social media, not all applicable, not all applicable to can be used in the international from the point of international criminal law, because the criminal law, international criminal law, does not forbid propaganda during armed conflicts. Does not forbid the international criminal law does not forbid propaganda during wartime or during armed conflict, and the only statements which call for genocide can be treated as war crimes. According to the international criminal law, they are crimes. But where is the difficulty? Calls for genocide is a separate call which is incriminating, but it must call for genocide against some defended, protected religious or national race or nation. I'm not saying that this genocide calls do not exist in the context of Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine, but it's more difficult to prove that these calls were calls for genocide. And so we have looked through this database, and we chose a different path. So we we took the crime which was already investigated by the International Criminal Court, in particular, ruining of civilian infrastructure, ruining of civilian accommodation, because they are two different crimes. And propaganda workers from Russian media who call for certain acts here in Ukraine, they are persecuted by the materials of our case, not as people who committed several crimes. They are persecuted as accomplices in the crimes of ruining of the civilian infrastructure, basically attack on civilian population. In particular, there are two types, two counts of crime of accomplices. Enticing to the crime and accomplishing, supporting the crime. Enticing means the phrases which we hear from the radio and TV, that we need to destroy civil infrastructure, to plunge Ukraine in darkness. Such statements, such things that from the point of law, they could really entice to a concrete crime. And so we consider such statements in connection with the attacks on infrastructure, on the population, which were committed soon after these statements had been made. And also justification, being an accomplice in this crime by justifying this crime after it had been committed, because on TV they explain why, they explain why it was necessary to carry out this attack, why it was necessary to destroy the power plant or hydropower plants. So in order to force this population to capitulate, to go to protest, to force Ukrainian authorities capitulation document. So we are speaking here about the overall policy of Russification, where Russia in general has a plan to Russify Ukrainian population, or the considerable part of Ukrainian population from the political point of view, culturally, economically, or Russia continues to physically destroy Ukrainians. And so we consider this from this angle. pursuing it from this angle. But of course, we are not 100% sure in the results, but we very much hope that the criminal court will consider our submissions and will add these persons whom we submitted to the cases that they already investigate. And maybe there will be, from Ukraine, from the side of Ukraine, there will be some steps. How many propaganda workers you included in that submission? 34 persons. 3-4 persons. In the submission, we collected all the evidence, carefully collected all the evidence about accomplices being enticers and accomplices. That includes Solovyov and Gurylev, Russian General Gurylev, who systematically calls for such crimes and then justifies these crimes. There is also a TV host, Sergei Mikheyev, who specializes in justification of ruining of civil infrastructure. And so currently we submitted 3-4 persons, but we have in our database approximately 50 people, 50 persons who also proclaimed such statements. So we started with 3-4 persons who really made a lot of such statements, a lot of such calls, but we have a lot of potential for other persons to submit their names. But as you said, propaganda workers, they prepare their population for the strike, then after the strike they justify. But I wanted to ask about the framework, about the narratives which are being spread. Do you see that they use some prompts pulled from the top? Yes, it's very noticeable, and those narratives, they change from time to time systematically. In the beginning, they were saying that all Ukrainians are fascist, Bandera supporters, but after their terror in the after terror attack in the Crocus City, they started to say that all Ukrainians are terrorists, and they spread this narrative for 1 year. And interesting is that different hosts in different TV programs, they use the same phrases, the same narratives, and it's very easy to track those narratives in many TV shows. This is so it proves that this is the state policy. Yes, and to continue what Ira says and answering your question, that this is actually planned state policy lately, especially since the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2024, 2025, we noticed that especially one topic, the calls to aggressions against other countries except Ukraine. Countries of the European Union, before they had calls for aggression against the United States. Now we see a bit less of that, but we see more calls that we need to bomb the center of decision-making center in Europe. We need to bomb those who help Ukraine. And we see that this is also planned informational attack. And see, we see actual, real informational attacks, and we see that there were many. Already, by now, there are several occasions when Russian drones have been spotted in the airspace of European countries, and so we can make a connection between each other. So when the Kremlin puts a task, a military political task, and propaganda workers clearly service this task, and they form certain opinion among the Russian population about the next steps de facto. And no matter how difficult it is, I'm very grateful to colleagues who can work with such narratives, in particular our documentary director, documentary journalist, she constantly monitors all these statements against Ukraine, against other countries, because by doing this, we can predict future steps of the Russian Federation. And in general, it's very important for formation of our Ukrainian policy, for our readiness. We have to analyze what Russian propaganda workers say, and our colleagues already noticed very clear system, because propaganda workers, they precede future steps, future actual steps. Dear, thank you. Colleagues, maybe you have additional questions to our guests. Good day, Inna Bonarenko, Radio Freedom. So can you tell us, so you submitted 3 names submitted to the International Court, and how long this procedure will continue, and what will be the result for them? And then we just keep our fingers crossed and just wait the result from the International Criminal Court. We know that the International Criminal Court investigated the situation in Ukraine for several years already. Maybe the prosecutor office will acknowledge that there is sufficient evidence to open criminal investigation against these persons, and then in that case, in several years, we should expect arrest orders, and if we're lucky, then someone of them will get behind bars and will be a trial process. But if not, we will continue working and collecting more evidence and submitting them to the international courts, and look for other ways, maybe engaging in other jurisdictions in other countries and initiating court process in other jurisdictions. But we hope that we will manage to actually get results, and these will be just first 3 persons who will be charged with responsibility. Anna commented on it from the legal point of view, but I think here also another important aspect, that it's a very clear legal framework, and our Ukrainian colleagues always say that Russian journalists, they have nothing even close to the definition of a journalist. They are propaganda workers. And I'm very happy that this information was submitted to the International Criminal Court. But also it's very important, this argument is very important in the conversation with our partners, because we see that even now for many Russian journalists, many countries are open to many Russian journalists. They feel free, they continue working in many countries, and we can see that many Russian informational agents, so to speak, they continue working in the European countries, trying to shape the opinion of the population in European countries, because and they try to impact electoral processes in European countries. And so it's very important to deliver this message that these people are not just people who breached this journalist standards. These are people who are involved in international crimes, in international war crimes. And that's why it's important to limit rights, limit basically the capabilities, the working capabilities for Russian journalists, because yes, we in Ukraine, we already saw for ourselves the consequences of the work of these journalists, but it's the matter of prevention for other countries, to prevent for Russia to spread its influence over them. And for us, it means a much broader context, which goes outside of Russia-Ukraine war and gives the chance to other countries in time to react preventively, so that to prevent this happening in their countries. Thank you. Next question. Greetings. My name is Kristina Chernevela, Suspilna Crimea. And so my question about the propaganda in the Crimea and how propaganda workers changed their narratives during 11 years and what now they're talking about the peninsula. About Crimea, it's quite interesting tendency, because in the beginning they ignited hatred towards Ukrainian journalists. They tried to scare them, to put them behind bars. After 2022, they started more severe persecution. Iryna Danilovich, she's behind bars on falsified accusations. And so Russia continues spreading hatred to Ukrainian journalists, bloggers, civil society activists. We know that now 17 journalists and bloggers are in prison behind bars, and Russians spread their narratives and hate speech towards Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, blaming them being terrorists. And in Crimea, there is Talipov blogger, so-called blogger Talipov, who has huge number of subscribers in Telegram channel, and he cooperates with FSB, and they just persecuting and hunting basically Ukrainian journalists, bloggers, and force them to apologize. And on false accusations, they throw them behind bars. And just because Talipova did not want to apologize for some statements she made in her Telegram channel, they put her behind bars. And even people who just write in simple things, innocent things like we're worrying for our soldiers, and they're being fined for that statements, and all the arrests, falsified arrests against people whom they call subversives. They just plant some explosive or bomb to a person, and they put behind bars for 17, 18 years based on this planted evidence, or maybe some people receive life sentences for that. And they spread, and this helps basically to spread the narrative that all Ukrainians left on the occupied territories, they are criminals and they must be persecuted. Thank you. What other questions? Volodymyr Iryna, National Council on the Matters of Television and Radio Broadcasting, representative of Special Commission of Sevastopol. Thank you for your work, first of all. It's very important. And secondly, I'm a lawyer. I'm human rights defender. And so as a lawyer, I have a question. If Ukraine does not receive the desired result, which you want, and Russia then will use, I think, will use this as a justification of their policy. They will say, okay, look, the International Criminal Court did not recognize their submissions, and so we are right, we're in the right, we can continue doing the same things that we are doing. So have you thought in advance your future steps if you get a rejection, if you don't achieve the result for which we are praying? First of all, of course, we want very much to achieve the desired result. But here we need to understand, even if we have positive result, it will come many years to come in ahead. And during all of those years, Russia will do a lot of harm to journalists and to civilians. At the same time, the political landscape is changing. We see processes in the human rights, in the international humanitarian law, in the international criminal law. And so maybe gradually the approaches will change towards where the freedom of speech ends and where the disinformation starts, and how to fight, how to counter this disinformation, because we living in the unique time when in this turbulent time when the standards which we use, they have been formed before in the pre-internet era, but we now in the internet era. And what was before, for example, genocide in Rwanda 30 years ago, calls for genocide in Rwanda, they were disseminated through radio. Millions of people heard them. Calls for genocide in Ukraine are being spread on radio, on TV, and online through the internet, and 100 million hear them. Like hundreds of millions of people call these calls for genocide in Ukraine, and I hope that this situation will press on international society and many separate other countries, and to recognize that there is certain disinformation which must be limited or banned or sanctioned. And possibly these political changes will take place sooner than charging actually with a responsibility will take place, and when the court verdict will be issued. And possibly there will be other aspects beside Russia-Ukraine war, and not criminal responsibility of certain persons, of particular persons, but maybe there will be recognized responsibility of a state, of a separate country, and maybe this aspect will help proceed with our cases. And also we shouldn't forget Eitman case. 14 years the state of Israel waited, condemned and tried and sentenced the criminal, and so we need to do our work, to continue doing our work. The Crimean human rights group is very important, and I think that sooner or later they will find their punishment, their court punishment by law. I also wanted to add that our task, we see our task as to document, collect this evidence, good quality evidence, document evidence, systematize this evidence, because currently we live in the war, and our task is to document the evidence. And then when maybe either changes in law, in legislation take place, and we will advocate for that, for the national investigation. I think this evidence will be definitely used, because they said so much and such horrible things that it will not be possible to ignore this evidence. And the more we think, the more evidence we have, the better chances we have to put them behind bars. And as for now, we have 600 such calls, and over 50 persons. And with the development of artificial intelligence, because currently artificial intelligence doesn't quite distinguish between certain intonation, but in future. Thank you very much. We work with documentation of crimes since 2014, and for us it's not the question of work, it's the question of basically our homeland. We are both from Crimea, for example, this is emotional to us, and we would like to see these people behind bars. But thanks for the example provided by Volodymyr, it's very important. It could take place, the court verdict could come 10 years from now, 15 years from now, but it's important because it's the matter of justice. I remember when we submitted material against Crimean judges and Crimean FSB workers, and 10 years now, some of these cases, court verdicts have been done, and some of these people have been sanctioned. So our work is such work is our work. Sometimes doesn't bring immediate results, but. Many actors from the state sector, non-state sector, private sector, we need to do our work, and it will help to change the system. And it's not in the number, like maybe 3 or 4 or 50 or 100 propaganda workers. The point is to change the system so that other propaganda workers in other countries, they understand risks for them, because right now Russia already calling for bombing other countries. And so if more people like we work to bring justice against these propaganda workers, and this will enable other countries to safeguard themselves. And if we have other stronger partners, then we will be able to conquer this joint enemy, this common enemy. The first speaker said about the disinformation. I wanted to get back to the question of disinformation. Mr. Borodianskyi, he is one of the authors of the known draft law on disinformation, which in 2020 was quite high profile and drew a lot of attention from the journalists. I studied these propositions. So in your opinion, don't you think having this background, because I remember just recently I read what BBC wrote about that had some hypothetical things. They pictured hypothetical things in 2020. And now we have real cases, how those hypotheses how they developed, because that was one of the stages of preparing to this full-scale war, which started in February 2022. So don't you think we should, in Ukraine, we should get back to the question of countering disinformation, not only at the level of journalist society, like ethical standards, but to get back to the legislative point of view and to introduce in the legislation maybe some punishment for disinformation, considering the law that was already enacted. Why I'm saying, because the occupation will take place sooner or later, because the empires, they don't last forever, and this empire will disappear as well with our help, or from the hands of our children, grandchildren, and we will have the name of propaganda workers, and not all of them will get the court verdict, guilty verdict, and those propaganda workers, they will be recycled again back in the Ukrainian society, and they will continue existing in this society. And unless our Ukrainian legislation is ready, they will continue being Ukrainian journalists. So that's why I think maybe we should now get back to the legislation, to the punishment for disinformation at the legislative level. It's a philosophical matter, Mr. Volodymyr. It's a difficult question. Currently, we are in war, in the war situation, and we need to use the tools that we have already now. Telegram channels, for example. We see what's going on in the Telegram channels, and we don't do anything about that. In particular, Ukrainian Telegram channels, and sometimes we know even who is behind those some Telegram channels. It's not Russian disinformation. There are other tools, but they're definitely not supporting our side. Now about Ukrainian media journalist society, we need to reload this media society as part of the legislature. There was an idea of co-regulation so that Ukrainian journalist society has for them to have a real instruments of influence, not just issuing out some certificates, some IDs, but so that the journalists have a real actual tool written in the legislation. There are examples from the British experience of certain agencies. So we need, it's not quick. We need to build this institute of journalism as an actor of a society. And the National Union of the Journalists of Ukraine, I had a direct conflict with the head of the union, but I think that they are outliving relic. They are relic, basically, of the modern days, the Union of the Journalists of Ukraine. And yes, I support this idea to build the tool for the journalist to be an active actor of society at the legislative level. Unfortunately, now we have all the tools to charge anyone with anything. I think we need to win the war, and then we will think how we will persecute or not persecute journalists for what they have done. Because now I think that's too early to think what we will do with journalists, so-called journalists in the occupied Crimea, because now the front is moving not in the right direction. And to summarize this discussion, it's a good question, and this question will always be relevant because it concerns the people on the occupied territory, not only those who supported Ukraine, but also people who were against Ukraine. And also, there's an interesting question about disinformation, because for Ukraine, important for development of Ukraine to understand, to clearly understand certain limits, but it's very easy to tip the balance, as Russia did many years before. So there are certain risks, but because for us, we work with occupied territories. This, from my point of view, this should be the vision of our state, of our country, how our country plans to restore its authority on the deoccupied territories. And I think it's good that we can discuss these things, but not good that a state over 11 years has not clearly formulated the answer to these questions. The law on the deoccupied territories still does not exist. It still requires changes, but these changes to the law shouldn't be sporadic. They should be based on a certain vision, on the strategy, what we're doing now, what we plan to do after we liberate those territories, and how Ukraine plans to restore its authority, to reestablish authority on the occupied territories. Because the process I see now are not healthy from my point of view, because we need not only to restore the power on the occupied territories, but also we need to preserve and restore healthy society on the occupied territories. And I don't see the plans for that. And unfortunately, currently, we go through the collaboration way, and we still don't have the adequate model that will ensure interests of the state and will not punish those people who are not related to the crime. We're still constantly getting back to the issue of passport, receiving Russian passport. And what I want to say, that our state needs to have clear vision about how it plans to restore its authority on the occupied territories, because there will be many questions. Teachers, journalists who worked under occupation, it's not for 1 or 2 years, it's for almost 12 years. But at the same time, we need, when it comes to 18 years old men, youth who are persecuted by FSB, who did everything for Ukraine to return. And we now see a lot of young population who resist even now in Crimea, even despite almost 12 years of total propaganda. So we need to find those boundaries, those limits, and it's not easy. And thank you for this question, because that means that we need to respond more effectively to these challenges. Thank you. If there are no questions, I want to thank to our guests. I remind that we were discussing the accomplice participation of Russian propaganda workers in international crimes and submission to the International Criminal Court, and the Media Center already works for the next year schedule. Please keep up with our schedule, and thank you for being with us.